Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. As you're signing in, you probably are noticing that there's a poll that we're asking you just a simple question. Are you already accredited to ISO IEC 17025? Yes, no, or in progress? Feel free to put some of that information in and just let us know kind of where you are. And we're going to share the results here shortly. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This webinar is the third episode in our series with A2LA around nonconformances with 17025. We're actually really going to specifically address externally provided products and service requirements. So we're very excited to kind of dive into this with you today. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. This is being recorded, so if you have to jump off early or if you want to share this with other people in your organization, once it's over, you're going to get a recording of it as soon as we have that available, and it'll automatically get sent to the email that you registered for this webinar with. Also, of course, there's going to be a Q&A section at the end of the presentation. So as questions come up, please feel free to put those into the Q&A area. We're going to address everything that we possibly can within the hour time frame and get to you the answers that you have questions about. All right, and there's the results of our poll. We can actually see here that the majority of the people on are under ISO IEC 17025 already. We have some that aren't, and then some are still in progress. So great, thank you guys for participating. Great to see that. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And I'm getting some feedback that we might have some audio issues. So if it's something that keeps happening, we will do our best to try to figure out what's happening. So I do want to introduce myself here, and if you've been to any of our webinars in the past, you've probably have heard me talk before, but my name is Karen Arriviaga, and I'm an account executive here at Qualtrax. Because we always have new people on and a mix of attendees, I do want to tell you just a little bit about who we are as a company. We are an all-in-one compliance software platform, really specifically designed to manage quality initiatives. Organizations usually turn to Qualtrax when they're looking to reduce or eliminate the burden associated with manual or paper-based systems by automating key processes. We've been around for a long time, actually. Qualtrax was founded back in '93 when our parent company was pursuing ISO 9001. Looking for a way to streamline that process, they started building software that would ultimately become the framework for Qualtrax today. They crushed their audit. Auditor said, hey, you guys have something here. You should really consider sharing it with others. And that's what we did as an organization, and is really start expanding Qualtrax into other areas of compliance where people really needed that type of management for their QMS systems. We really started focusing on laboratories about 15 years ago and have really seen how our product has evolved to really meet the specific requirements of ISO IEC 17025, as well as many other types of standards that are out there. More than 25 years later, we're now a leader in the compliance industry, and we're happy to actually account several of the accrediting body customers or as our customers. In fact, A2LA, who we're presenting with today, is also a customer and user of Qualtrax. So now, without further ado, I want to introduce you to Bibi Abdullah. So Bibi is an accreditation specialist at the American Association for Laboratory Accreditation, A2LA. She supports the day-to-day operations of accreditation by assisting clients in obtaining, maintaining accreditation in the fields of materials testing and inspection bodies. In addition, she is an A2LA's point of contact for CPSC, as well as a deputy for A2LA's forensic program. Ms. Abdullah has been an employee of A2LA since March 2018. So with that, Bibi, I'm going to invite you. I'm going to stop sharing and you can share the screen and you can go ahead and start.
All right. Thank you, Karen. I'm going to pull up the presentation. Hopefully everything looks good.
Looks great from my side.
Perfect. So good afternoon or morning, depending on where you guys are. I'm not entirely sure, but thank you all for joining this webinar and taking time out of your Wednesday to come and listen to boring standard stuff, but still relevant potentially to your organization. It seems like some of you aren't accredited 17025, but maybe you're considering it. So like Karen mentioned, this particular webinar is specifically for externally provided products and services requirements that are within ISO IEC 17025, so section 6.6 of the standard. And what I want to go through today is talk about the top 5 nonconformances that we see in section 6.6, as well as talking about the requirements and ways that we can, or I can show you guys how to conform to these specific requirements. And these tips are going to be based on just things that I've seen from organizations that I've worked with, as well as from trainings that I've done, just ideas and topics that have come up to kind of give you guys an insight on the different ways that you can meet these requirements and the flexibility that you have as an organization. And another thing I want to note is that there are new requirements in this particular section of the standard, and so I actually went ahead and italicized those new requirements on the slide so that it's very obvious what are new requirements versus what are the old 2005 requirements of 17025. So before I get into actually going through the nonconformances, I want to talk a little bit about the distribution and where we get this data from as far as the deficiencies that were cited. So this came from last year, the audit that AAA did in 2019. And one thing that I want to note is that the majority of audits that we did last year were for labs that were transitioning. So a lot of these labs were going from the 2005 version of the standard to the 2017 version of the standard. And therefore, because of these new requirements that were in place, they missed these new requirements. And that was a big reason why a lot of the deficiencies were cited against 6.6. And so it's the top 4th section of the standard that had deficiencies cited in 2019, making up 21% of the deficiencies cited. And of the section itself, of section 6.6, the distribution is heavily based in 6.6.2 where the new requirements lie. And so there are new requirements for procedures and records in section 6.6 that have been missed when transitioning from the 2005 version of the standard to the 2017 version of the standard. And so it makes up a large portion of what was actually cited last year. So 6.6.2 is made up of 4 sections, and I'm actually going to talk about all 4 of those sections today, as well as one of the sections from 6.6.3, and that section is actually kind of interesting because that's the section that we tend to see a lot of deficiencies cited against, but those deficiencies are typically invalid. And so I wanted to touch on that so that if any of you were internal auditors, for example, you would know how exactly to go about assessing that clause, because there aren't any procedural or record requirements for 6.6.3. So I'm going to jump into the first section, and this is the top nonconformance that we see in section 6.6.2, which is B. So it's a little out of order, but section B of 6.6.2 requires you to have a procedure and record for evaluating, selecting, monitoring of performance, and reevaluation of your external providers. And this makes up almost 20% of the deficiencies that are cited in 6.6, so it's a pretty decent chunk. As far as addressing this particular procedure, you want to have an understanding of what evaluation, selection, and monitoring are. So evaluation is just a way that you're gauging the qualifications that you set out for these particular external providers. So how are you going to, measure whatever criteria you set in place against this particular provider? So if you have a calibration provider, for example, maybe you want to make sure that they're accredited. So you would, go and see if they're accredited. Maybe you want to make sure that they can provide calibrations for whatever is on your scope for the pieces of equipment that you're looking to get calibrated. Maybe you're worried about cost. Like, there's a ton of different factors that you can consider when it comes to evaluating, and that's really up to you as an organization. And a little bit is fed from 6.6.2a, which I'll get to in just a second. When it comes to selection, you're looking at the data that you've gathered from this evaluation process and making a decision of whether or not you want to use that provider. And so it's really just selecting someone based on the research that you did on that particular external provider. And then with monitoring, that's just a periodic review of your external provider. And essentially, there's no frequency set in place for this particular requirement. So you can monitor them every time you get a product or service. You can monitor them once a year, et cetera. It's really dependent on whatever risk you want to take for this. And then the reevaluation is just following that evaluation process that you did initially when you first selected that particular external provider. So when we think about tips, the procedure is really just you detailing the process of evaluation, selection, and monitoring. A lot of the times what I see is labs, and this is because of labs that were previously accredited to the 2005 version of 17025, is that they had some sort of form that they would use when it came to evaluating and selecting. And then they would say, okay, if the calibration provider or the proficiency testing provider met these pieces of the criteria after the evaluation, we would say that they were approved to be used for our products and services. And for monitoring of performance, that's up to you and how frequently you want to do it, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. But a lot of the times I see labs incorporate that into their management review. And so they'll do it, once a year, twice a year, however often they do their management review. And since there's a requirement for the management review to have a record of whatever inputs you have, you would automatically have a record, meeting this particular clause. So you can have some sort of approved vendors list, which was actually a requirement in the previous version of the standard, or you could, have some record from your management review. Now, that being said, the standard doesn't tell you what type of record you need. So you could use a LIMS, you could use a spreadsheet, you could use a form, like whatever works for your organization. It's really up to you, as long as you have a record of following your procedure. So that wraps up 662B. So I'm going to jump into 662A. And this is a completely new requirement that the standard has put in place for 2017. So you now have to have a procedure and record for defining, reviewing, and approving the products and services received. And this makes up 11% of the deficiencies that are cited against this particular section of the standard. And when it comes to addressing the procedure, really you're defining the requirements for the products and services that you attain externally. And depending on the types of, or what the intended use of the products and services are, you're going to have specific things influence what you would define as the criteria. A lot of that is going to come from 6.4, which is the equipment section of 17025. A lot of the products and services that you get externally are going to be equipment related. And so you may find those pieces, that acceptance criteria, defined in that section of the standard versus in 662A. But you are responsible to have some sort of procedure that has these pieces of the criteria defined for you. And when it comes to the records, when it comes to approving the criteria, which is one of the requirements in 662A, you just need to have something as simple as approving the procedure, having some sort of a approving authority that, approves a procedure that has this criteria defined, someone who's can look through it and say, yes, this is, sufficient criteria for whatever product or service that I'm looking to have for my organization. And I'll touch a little bit on criteria a little bit later when I kind of wrap up 662. But if we move on to 662C, this is essentially the check clause of the section. So once you have defined your criteria, you selected your external provider, and you're requesting these products and services, you want to ensure that you are making sure that the requirements that you set in place, so the requirements that you defined in 662A, are being met before you use these products or services. So you're checking to make sure the calibration is what you were looking for before you use that piece of equipment, or whatever service that you may be directly giving to the customer, for example. And this makes up 10% of the deficiency cited for section 6.6. So when you're addressing the procedure, the way that the standard is written, it's telling you that you shall ensure, it's written in a way that it's ensuring that this check gets done. So you can be it kind of gives you a little bit of flexibility on how exactly you address it in the procedure. You can be a little vague with it. As long as, the procedures are ensuring that this check gets done, you can kind of manipulate the procedure to how you want. You don't have to go into a lot of detail as you would maybe for 662A and 662B. And as far as records are concerned, you want to make sure that you have a record of approving this product or service before you actually put it into use. And so that can be anything from a signature, a stamp, a sticker, whatever works and whatever is in the process of your organization, you can use as an indication of approval. And then we also recommend that there's some way that you checked, and this isn't a requirement, but just a recommendation that you actually checked it against the criteria that you set out. And the reason for that is just because it helps you, if anything were to go wrong later on, you do this check and everything's fine, and then later on you find out that there actually is an issue, you would be able to go back and say, okay, well, when I received it, everything was fine, so maybe something happened afterwards, and you could kind of do that. It helps with the traceability aspect, and it helps if you have to do any sort of non-conforming work investigation when a piece of equipment, turns out to not work the way that you expected it to. So that makes up 662C. So if we talk about 662D, and this is the last subsection of 662D, and it's a completely new requirement, and now the procedure is the standard is asking you to have a procedure and record where you're addressing actions or defining how you would take action from evaluations, monitoring, and reevaluation of external providers. So for example, if you were, you did a management review and you incorporated reviewing, the performance of your external provider, and then it turns out that over the year they made this many mistakes, or there was issues with the calibration that you received, or the PT samples never got to you for your proficiency testing provider, whatever the case is, you monitor that performance, and then you decide, okay, I think I need to find a new calibration provider, or I need to find a new PT provider. You would want to have a procedure that addresses how you would go about doing that. It doesn't mean that it needs to be a very detailed procedure, but you just need to address that and then have a record of whatever action you took. So this makes up 8% of the deficiencies of this particular section. And again, it's because labs were transitioning from 2005 to 2017, and then they missed this new requirement. So it'll be interesting as we go on, to the end of 2020, 2021, looking at the data of the nonconformances and seeing if, this section kind of gets minimized because labs are now used to these new requirements and now they're being addressed. So as far as the tips for 662D, this being the action clause, you, like I said, want to have a procedure that addresses how the lab will act if, any sort of issue arises during the evaluation or the monitoring of your external providers. And you can make it as detailed or as vague as you want. It's really dependent on the types of products and services and the types of external providers that you have, that you may want to write your procedure in a certain way so that the actions are being taken as appropriate. And as far as the records are concerned, if you have, for example, in 662C, you evaluate the piece of equipment that comes in before you use it, and then it turns out that that piece of equipment didn't meet your requirements. You may have some sort of action that comes out of that, and then you would want to make sure that you keep a record of that action. And so the 662C record kind of covers the 662D record if you are checking it, before you use that piece of equipment. Now, there are instances, like I mentioned, where the piece of equipment or whatever other product or service that you had, it turns out that it wasn't meeting the intended use after you start using that product or service. And so this would most likely need to be addressed through a non-conforming work process, depending on what that product or service is. So if it is a piece of equipment that's not meeting the requirements that you need, you may need to do a non-conforming work investigation in order to determine, if the validity of your results and things among that nature are being affected. And so you'll have a record for that because 710, I believe that's the clause of non-conforming work within 17025 requires you to have a record of your non-conforming work investigation and any actions that are taken. And so that section of the standard will also cover the record portion of 662D. So you'll see, as you're going through the standard, you'll see that there's a lot of different areas that will kind of flow into each other, and records in the management review section, for example, could meet potentially 662B when you're monitoring the performance or reevaluating your external providers. So that wraps up 662 in its entirety. So there were 4 sections. And so I kind of want to take you guys through the PDCA process, which is essentially what 662 mimics. And so PDCA is Plan, Do, Check, Act. And so if we look at 662 as a whole, and if we start at 662A, 662A kind of acts as that plan. You're defining the requirements of your those external products and services that you receive from these providers. You're defining the requirements. You have this, acceptance criteria. You're looking at all of the different things that may influence this criteria, whether it's the accreditation body, whether it's your customers, whether it's regulators. You have all of these different aspects that are influencing what type of criteria that you want to define for these products and services. So that's your plan. And then you get to 662B, which is, defining the criteria for your external providers. And so that is your due clause. So that is where you're now taking the time to evaluate and select these providers based on the requirements that you have set in place for your products and services. And so making sure that they're meeting a certain, depending on what your mission is and depending on what service level you're expecting, you may want to define the criteria based on that. So you're going to have some sort of risk involved as far as, how you're going to actually define these and evaluate these suppliers. And then if you get to 662C, like I mentioned, this is your check clause. So this is where you're going to take a look at the products and services that you received and see, whether or not they're actually meeting those requirements that you defined in 662A. And then if it turns out that they're not meeting the requirements, or later on you find that they're not meeting the requirements, you're going to be taking a look at 662D, where now you're taking some sort of action. This is your act clause, where you're taking action based on the issues that arise during your evaluation or during your check or during your monitoring of performance. And so it's kind of a loop almost, because once you go into 662D and you take action on these issues, maybe you do a reevaluation of your provider. Maybe you feel like your provider isn't meeting the defined requirements that you put in place. So maybe you want to review the requirements and criteria that you put out for that provider. Or maybe you want to take the time to review the criteria that you set in place for your products and services. So you would have to kind of do that kind of investigation, determine, where the issue lies and where you would have to fix it. And so it's kind of a loop where you're going through the process. As you're reevaluating and monitoring, there's going to be issues that arise, and maybe you're going to have to revisit your plan, or take a look at the due clause, whatever the case may be. So it's this cycle that you go through, and it's like this continuous improvement ideology that the standard likes to preach throughout. And so if we jump into the next slide, so this is the mission, service, and performance that I kind of touched on a little bit before. So relating to mission criteria, you have things that are going to heavily affect the validity of your results and the consistency of your results, which is a very important aspect of the standard. It's something that the standard is kind of written to ensure confidence in these aspects, the validity of the results and the consistency of the results. And so if you're getting a piece of equipment that, impacts whether or not the validity and consistency of your results is, good, then you're going to want to put that kind of above everything else as far as the type of criteria. Maybe you want to be more stringent with your criteria. Maybe you want to have very specific requirements for that particular product, because you know that it's going to heavily affect your results. Whereas, you know, if it's a supporting process for your laboratory activities, maybe you don't have as much of a stringent requirement for the externally provided uh, external provider for your products and services. And then another thing to look at is the service level itself. Do you want someone that's accredited, or do you want someone that's just, you know, certified to ISO 9001, for example? And the biggest difference between 17025 and 9001 is that 17025 is more of a measure of competence, where 9001 is more of a measure of just having a management system in place that the lab or organization is following. So there's a very big difference between the two of them. And so depending on, you know, your regulator requirements or your customer requirements or your accreditation body requirements, that's going to help dictate what type of service level you're going to need for these providers. And then as far as performance criteria, you know, if you have a calibration provider and you need to make sure that that calibration provider is accredited so that you're getting these accredited calibrations, you're going to want to monitor their accreditation status. You know, are they still accredited? You know, maybe you want to do that before you request a new calibration from them, or maybe you just want to do it once a year. Maybe you know that they're a good calibration lab, so you trust them, and so you monitor them less frequently than if, you know, doing it every time you get a calibration from them. So it's kind of up to you on what risk you want to take on for your organization. And then other aspects that aren't necessarily related to the validity of your results, but you could also consider customer service. You know, are they meeting their turnaround times for you? If, you know, if you requested something and they said they would get it to you in 2 weeks and then it's been 3 weeks, like maybe that's something that you want to consider as far as performance monitoring. The quality of the service that you receive or the quality of the product that you receive. And then the price is also a big thing, you know, depending on how often you're getting that product or service provided to you, you may want to consider the price. And so those are different things to think about, and to kind of to get you into the idea of, you know, taking on some sort of risk assessment when you're coming up with these different pieces of criteria for the products and services that you are requesting. So that makes up the top 4 nonconformances that are cited against 6.6. So I'm actually going to talk about one of the other clauses, which is 6.6.3b. This is not a new requirement, but it's something that actually is less stringent in this version of the standard for 2017 versus 2005. And it requires labs to communicate its requirements relating to acceptance criteria to the external providers. And in the previous version of the standard, there was a requirement for the lab to have some sort of process documented for this, as well as a record of doing this. And those have both been taken away. And so now there's no record or document that's required for this particular section. And it's a typical deficiency that you'll see, mainly because when assessors are kind of in that ideology of like best practice, where it's like, okay, like it would make sense to have a record of you communicating these requirements so that if you don't get those requirements, you have something to trace back to and say, hey, I asked for this, you didn't give this, you know, here's my evidence. So it's kind of a best practice thing to have that record, but the standard doesn't require it. So a lot of the times we'll see this cited, you know, from an assessor, and then it's like, well, this isn't really a valid deficiency because of the fact that there is no requirement for there to be a procedure and there is no requirement for there to be a record. So it makes up 7% of the deficiencies cited in 6.6, but the majority of these deficiencies are actually invalid. And so when you think of it from an internal auditor standpoint, when it comes to assessing a clause like this that's very process-based and not so much procedural-based, you want to take a look at the process and then take a look at the end result. So maybe you want to take a look at section 6.6.2c. You know, after we do this check, is the requirements that I set out in 6.6.2a being met? And then if not, maybe it's a problem with the provider, or maybe it's a problem with your communication process. And that would be some sort of investigation that you would have to take on. And so as far as tips are concerned, the standard doesn't define the communication that you do. So you can do a phone call, you can do an email, purchase order. A lot of the times labs just do it in the purchase order. It's the easiest way to communicate the requirements. But it's really up to you, again, on what makes the most sense for your lab. Some labs are internal, and so it can be easy as a conversation that they have with their coworker that says, hey, I need X, Y, and Z, and they get it done. So it's really up to you as an organization to determine how you want to go about doing these particular processes. And that's the nice thing about this version of the standard, is that they took away so many of the previous procedures that were required, that you are able to have so much more flexibility on what works for your organization. It's very standard. It's more, it favors the laboratories versus the auditors. So, you know, it makes it a little harder to audit some aspects of the standard just because it is so process-based and so risk-based. But it gives you as an organization the flexibility to say, okay, well, this doesn't make sense for me to do a purchase order if I'm an internal lab and I don't need to, you know, do this extra work in order to communicate my acceptance criteria for a particular piece of equipment or product or whatever it may be. So that concludes the nonconformances. And so in summary, just please ensure, for those of you who that may still be transitioning, or those of you who are new, just making sure that you meet these new requirements of the standard. For the most part, it's pretty straightforward, at least from what I've seen from organizations. When they actually get the requirements, it makes sense to them, and then they're able to actually document the procedure. And it's important to communicate that these procedures don't have to be super detailed or super complex or convoluted or anything. Like, it just needs to make sense enough and documented to the extent that it meets whatever intended requirement that you have in place. So it can be very simple, it can be detailed. As long as you're getting the intended result, you're meeting the requirements of the standard. And then just ensuring that any actions that are taken as you're going through these these procedures, they're being recorded and documented. And then lastly, just communicating that acceptance criteria to the external providers. This is typically an invalid deficiency, but you know, if you find that in 662C that you're consistently not getting the requirements that you set in place for your externally provided products and services, maybe you want to take a look at your communication process and revisit it, and then say, maybe I need to do a better job of documenting, or maybe I should create a procedure for this because this process isn't giving me products and services that are meeting the requirements I defined for them in 662A. So that concludes my portion of this webinar. Thank you all for listening. I think we'll do the Q&A after Karen goes over a few things in Qualtrax, if I'm not mistaken.
You're right. You're
all
right.
So I'm going to stop sharing.
Wonderful.
And pass it on to Karen.
Great. And then I will start sharing. All right. Let's get this going. Okay. Can you see my screen, BB?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. And we already have some really great questions coming in, so keep them coming. My part will be very short so we can get right to some of those questions. So BB, thank you so much for going through all of those details. And I really think like some of that information that you're provided is really going to help people really take away some good content from this presentation. So really at this point, what I'm going to do is shift a little bit to, well, how does Qualtrax help in these types of situations? And we have a number of our customers that are 17025 that are actually using Qualtrax to help manage their external providing products and services, specifically around clause 6.6.2. So let's dive into this a little bit further. What you're seeing here is your inbox, and it's your homepage ultimately for all the tasks you need to complete in your system when you log into Qualtrax. Now, let's pretend here that I need to buy a GCMS. I'm going to purchase that from Agilent. Well, Agilent, for my organization, we've never used them before as a vendor. So based on the process that we have put in place at my laboratory to evaluate vendors, we need to properly go through our process to evaluate Agilent. How we're going to do that is actually use a workflow. Now, we have what is called our vendor approval workflow. And this happens to be a best-in-class workflow that automatically comes with your Qualtrax instance, especially if you're under IEC 17025. It's one of 6 that come with your system. And really what this workflow is designed to do is to allow you to capture information about your vendors, create a list of them, collect all the information needed to evaluate them further, and then get that final approval, and even help with the reminders that you need to set to reevaluate and monitor that vendor. You know, when you're listening to BB's presentation, she talks about the importance of having a defined procedure to meet section 6.6.2, right? Especially 6.6.2a, which encompasses making sure you're evaluating your vendor, making sure that you're evaluating the products once you have them in your hand, and then even what do you do if you're not satisfied with those products, or what are the next steps if you need to take action further? With Qualtrax workflows, the way that they work is that they're designed to automate processes where each step is defined with customizable fields and routed with automatic email alerts and notification. Now, because every vendor instance entered into this workflow is going to be forced to the same steps each time, it's allowing you to prove conformance to the process you put in place. So typically, what happens if you don't have Qualtrax is you have an SOP that explains what your processes are around section 6.6.2, all aspects of that process. With Qualtrax, you can actually handle it a little bit differently. Instead of having some of those SOPs, instead you can actually build your workflow to specifically outline what that SOP is requiring. And so that's what we're doing with this workflow specifically for vendor approvals. So this one is really going to address 6.6.2b, but I'm going to show you a little bit later how we can actually encompass all aspects of 6.6.2. So the first step of this process is just initiating a vendor and putting that vendor on your vendor list. So you can see up here at the top, it says specifically just what's that vendor name. So in this case, we're going to put in Agilent. When you look at the diagram below here, this is step 1, which is just adding that vendor to my list. You'll notice that there's an arrow that's going to take me to another step that's called vendor information. At this step, that's where I'm putting all of that information that we've outlined as critical in order to evaluate this vendor. Anytime you see an arrow within a Qualtrax workflow, that's going to represent an email notification and an inbox notification, going to the next party in line, letting them know that it's now their responsibility to complete that task. These notifications hold people accountable because these tasks will not get dropped from their Qualtrax instances, and they will continually get reminders to make sure that they get this work finished. So we're going to initiate this process, and it's going to take me to the next step, which is where I actually input that information about the vendor itself. So what day is this being evaluated? We would choose today. Who's actually doing the evaluation? Trevor in this case, so I'll put him down. What am I going to be using this vendor for? Well, so in this case, I'm going to be purchasing a GMS that I'm going to be using to analyze finished products within my laboratory. Are these critical? Yes or no? Are they accredited? Yes. And because we are doing this webinar with A2LA, we'll go ahead and pick A2LA as their accreditor and so on. The next step is adding a copy of their certificate that shows their accreditation or certification, or any details that you guys have outlined in your process that you need added to this vendor to make sure that they are a sound vendor and that you want to work with them. So I would come in here and choose a file. I can just pick an external file and it will automatically upload it to this record. I can even add comments here if I want to. Now, every field that you see here in the subform within Qualtrax is configurable. And this is really where you guys can take your processes that you've put in place for your organization and start building them out within Qualtrax. Because if there's additional information that you need for your evaluation that you want to include in here, you absolutely can add that at any point to these workflows and really make them your own to really control your process. The next step of this process is making sure that you're adding an accreditation expiration date or a reevaluation date. You know, BB talked about this being a critical step of 6.6.2 in the sense that you're going to determine when these are going to be reevaluated. Same principles apply here. In this case, because they are certified, I want them to be, I want to reevaluate them when the certification expires. Well, let's pretend that this is not too long away. It's in August on the 31st. I would put in that date, and then I'm going to receive an email notification from Qualtrax when this date comes to go in and actually reach out to this vendor and get their updated information. Next step of this process is submitting it to QA for review. That person, who also happens to be Trevor in this case, will then get an email notification, inbox notification, asking them to complete the next steps of the process. They'll see the information that was submitted during the evaluation, and they can continue on. So, was this information reviewed? Yes or no? Was the vendor approved, rejected? Maybe additional information is needed. They will have these action items that they could take. In this case, we'll say it's approved. You can move on with purchasing, and then you would come down here and see your route options. So in this case, if it was rejected, I could close it and say, no, we are not going to be using this vendor anymore. If it is approved, we can click this, or if I need additional information, it can actually push this workflow back to the person that did the evaluation. In this case, I'm going to approve it. And you'll notice the workflow goes away. This instance is complete and will not reappear until August 31st when this vendor needs to be reevaluated. Now, what does that look like? I actually have one set up already in the system to kind of show you what that notification looks like. So here's one under my vendor approvals. This is where you get notifications about workflows in your inbox. Surency, if I were to click this, their vendor approval actually expires today. So in this case, I can go in, see the information that was submitted back when they were evaluated in 2018, and then see that I need to put in information when I talk to them now. So I would type in when they're evaluated, say who I am, what materials and services, update that certification or the scope that's here. Again, adding additional details to this record. So when your auditor comes in and they ask you to see how you're evaluating your vendors, you can simply pull up an example and show that auditor every instance of evaluation that you've done for that specific vendor. Really easy way to get your vendor list within Qualtrax is to run an advanced search. So I click the advanced button up here in my search engine, and I'm going to click vendor approval. And when I open this up, I can actually search my full vendor list. And at any point, if I want to dive into a vendor even further, I can come over here and choose one, and it's going to take me to that vendor record. So I can see who they are, when they were evaluated, and all the information that I would need to get right there. Now, one of the things that we talk about at Qualtrax often, especially if you've been on any of our webinars or in the past, or if I know we've got some customers on here today too, is the ability to configure these workflows. We talked about how this one really helps with proving that you're following your process about just evaluating your vendors. But what about 6.6.2C when you're actually evaluating the products themselves, or 6.6.2D when you've got to figure out what you're going to do in the event that the products that a vendor has supplied you aren't satisfactory to your organization? With Qualtrax, you have the ability to adjust our best-in-class workflows. You also have the ability to build your own workflows in Qualtrax. What we went ahead and did, and this is a snapshot just so you can kind of get an idea of how flexible these workflows are, is we took that best-in-class workflow for vendor approval, which actually are these 4 steps up here. So adding a vendor to our list, bringing in that vendor information, approving that vendor, and then closing it. We've taken those 4 steps and expanded on them. So now let's pretend that one of my vendors has been approved, and now I need to make the same order again, but for similar supplies. Well, because that vendor is already approved, I know I can order from that vendor. So instead of going through that vendor approval process now, I can simply go to my vendor list, select that vendor, and submit another order. So the first thing that you'll see is that that vendor is already approved and I want to make another purchase. So this is a way that we've taken this workflow, changed it to also include purchase requests and areas that help with some of these other sections in 6.6.2. So in this, I'm going to actually fill in my purchase request. What am I purchasing? What's important to me? What are my requirements? And so when BB is talking about making sure that you are capturing those requirements and sharing them and such, this is a great way to make sure that what your data aligns with what you're sharing with your vendors. So you would enter it here. Once those products have been ordered and you've received them, then you need to evaluate them. Well, by adding a step here for evaluation, you're able to take your products that you've received and evaluate them to make sure that they align with what your provider told you that they were going to be sending and what you've ordered. And so putting fields at this step to really make sure that you're asking some of those questions is a great way to customize this further so you can capture that information in those records in 6.6.2 C. Now, 6.6.2D talks about, well, what happens if the information that was sent to you or the products that were sent to you are unsatisfactory? If there's something wrong, what do you do? What's the action that you guys are going to take? Well, no matter what process that you've put in for your organization, you have the ability to automate that in Qualtrax too. So you can see here, we have another arrow coming down that gives us a couple options. So if your organization chooses to kick off a corrective action request for unsatisfactory goods, or maybe an incident report, or you decide, I'm going to take this vendor back through the approval process because maybe if they're sending me wrong goods or services, maybe I don't want to be using them anymore. You know, this is where you would elaborate on that part of the process to make sure you're in conformance with 6.6.2D. So just to give you a snapshot of some of the configurability that you have in the system, you know, you really have the ability to take these, make them your own. And we've seen some really interesting things from our customers and what they've been able to do with the system itself. On top of workflows, Qualtrax isn't just workflows. You know, we do have document management that you're able to use to make sure you have those controlled documents and that the versioning of those documents are controlled. We also offer testing and training that helps you track competency and awareness amongst your employees. Now, every single thing that Qualtrax offers does sit on top of a reportable platform, which means that you just have visibility into those products or into those reports so you can make sure that you're ready for your audits, and which also helps keep audit time down and prep because everything's going to be in one location. Now, the finer feature I'll mention, which is sometimes overlooked when evaluating products, is our customer service. So sometimes when you're in the mindset of looking for products to fit your needs or your budget, you're thinking about, sometimes you're not thinking about, well, what happens when the product's in place itself, or what can I expect from my vendor? You know, we really pride ourselves on going above and beyond for our customer base. And so whether we're going to help you through training and implementation with our product itself. We're going to help you with customer service and our support teams. They're here based in where we're based in, which is Blacksburg, Virginia. Our customer satisfaction rate with those teams are about 98%. So it's really something that we put a lot of energy into. If you really want to evaluate Qualtrax further, I recommend either reaching out to us, joining one of our 30-minute webinars, or even checking us out on review sites like Capterra. You know, we were actually just named the best ease of use for accreditation management software and best value for accreditation management software on Capterra. So if this is something that you might be looking to in the future, let us know. We're happy to help. Well, with that being said, I know we've got a bunch of questions coming in. So Bibi, why don't you join me? And we can start going through these questions that we've got.
Okay.
All right, here's the first one. And when it came in, I was like, wow, this is a really great one. This one's going to be towards you. In this process, you have to evaluate the main product, but the manufacturer and the distribution company also. Example, a microbiology culture media for your testing X that is manufactured by company Y and then distributed by your country by the company Z. Do you have to evaluate all three of these companies and the product?
So I agree. This is a great question. And I would say, I want to say that you really only be evaluating and having against the manufacturer company versus the company that distributes the product, just because if the manufacturer is the one that's creating the product, and then they're just, hiring some external body that's distributing that product to you, and that distribution company has no effect on that product other than maybe if it's a piece of equipment and maybe something, depending on how they ship it, maybe something gets affected. I would say you really only have to focus on the manufacturer and then having some defined criteria for the product that you communicate to that manufacturer. You mean, hopefully
Great.
that's what you were looking for.
No, thank you so much. Here's another one. Do all providers need to be evaluated, recorded, even if they provide services and supplies that do not affect the quality of testing?
So for this, it's really focused on, and a lot of these requirements are revolving around the laboratory activities. So if it's in some way even like a support process, like item handling or things like that, then you would want to evaluate that externally provided or that external provider. So it's really dependent on how exactly that product or service ties back into your laboratory activity. So that if they have no effect in any way or any involvement in the laboratory activities, then I would say, no, you do not need to evaluate them.
Great. Is a manufacturer's factory calibration adequate to provide proof of accuracy per the ISO 17025 standard when the instrument is brand new? Following the new period, we would require a certificate of calibration to ISO 17025 afterwards.
Correct. So the standard itself only requires you to get a calibration done. The requirement for it to be to an accredited calibration provider actually comes from ILAC and their P series. And so that is a requirement that's actually imposed onto accreditation bodies from ILAC to then impose onto their customers. And so there is an exception within that P series policy that allows you to wait until that initial calibration cycle before you get an accredited calibration. So yes, regardless, you're okay with having the initial factory calibration.
Great, thank you. You mentioned for 6.6.2a that you have to document the approval of the criteria. I don't see a requirement in ISO 17025. Is that an A2LA requirement?
So 662A, if I read it from the standard, it says defining, reviewing, and approving the laboratory's requirements for externally provided products and services. So there is an approving aspect in there. So it's not an A2LA requirement. A2LA just gives advice on how you may want to document that approval of the criteria, whether it's through just having some sort of approving authority for the procedure, or if it's somehow intertwined in the other records that you have for your products and services.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, and this one's from Paul. If there isn't a need for documentation for 6.6.3, what are some best practices for showing proof to an auditor?
Okay, so this is a good question because since this is kind of one of those tricky process clauses that are a little harder to, audit to. And so one thing that we tell our assessors is, when it comes to processes, you're having a conversation and then looking for evidence. So you ask them, the organization, what their process is for communicating these requirements. And then you're going to tell the auditor to check different sections of the standard. So for example, we'll have them look at 662C. What record do they have from that check to say, whether or not they were actually meeting the requirements that they set out for that product or service. That's a big area to look at. And this clause is something that is hard to cite because there is no requirement for documentation or for a record. You can, if you want to make it easier to have that, just listed in the PO. That's what most organizations have anyway as part of their process. But it's really up to the auditor to kind of look for that evidence and show that proof, because as long as your products and services are meeting the requirements that you set out for them, that's all the evidence the auditor needs. There's nothing more that you have to do to show that your communication process is meeting the requirement of the standard.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'll say when the standard came out, when the newer standard came out, at least from the Qualtrax perspective, when 2017 came out, we actually met with some of the representatives for A2LA to try to understand this better too, because what we're starting to see is that there's a shift in from our customer base, and even more importantly, new customers that are new to 17025 that purchase our system. And they're building out these processes in Qualtrax workflows rather than having just the document in the document section of the product, because they're able to skip that step without having the document in Qualtrax and just build out the workflow. And the workflow itself is actually their proof to the auditor. They're actually able to give the auditor just access to Qualtrax. They create a username and password for that auditor, and the auditor comes in or is able to run reports, or is able to see how the process is controlled. And it's actually making that process pretty streamlined for that auditor. Here's another question. Do we need to communicate acceptance criteria to suppliers for non-critical supplies, such as pens, paper, hand soap, etc.?
So this is similar to the question that I answered a little bit earlier, where if it's not directly related or somehow impacting your laboratory activities, then no, you don't need to go above and beyond and do it for miscellaneous items. So no, you do not need to communicate acceptance criteria for those items.
And then another question from Gary. Are there tips for how to get final user at the lab to report problems with products or services back to the purchasing or quality department in cases where it is usable, not critical to quality, but not ideal, more than annoyance factor?
So that's almost up to you on how you want to go about doing that, because there is no requirement in the standard for you to have to do that kind of, like, it's really just, is there an action that's arising, or is the product okay to, put into service? If you want to have some sort of, maybe on your form, if you have a form or a checklist or however you go about, doing that check clause of 662C, maybe you want to incorporate some sort of note section where you can write, whatever issue that, doesn't affect the piece of equipment or product or service or whatever it is that you got, but maybe you just want to note it so that for future reference, the quality department can look back at it. That could be one way that you can go about doing that. It's an interesting question. I've never gotten that one before. So I would say it's kind of up to you and how you want to go about doing it, but that could be one way where you just incorporate it onto whatever form or record that you use for 662 and then have it be communicated that way.
Yeah, we see that similar in Qualtrax. What some of our customers will do is they'll add text fields at certain parts of the workflows, and not because something needs to be acted on with that information that's been given in that text field, like notes. It's not that something has to be done because of the note that's given, but when they start running their reports and they're looking for risks or opportunities, improvements, if they can run that data and see that in a report and start identifying recurrences in that data, then they start realizing that, hey, this is something that we were just taking note of that might actually be more severe than we thought. So maybe we need to add that to our risk assessment and risk list, or maybe we need to really consider that during management review or such. Can I offer some inputs? And so Tony has some ideas here. He says, ensure you evaluate your accrediting bodies too, since they are considered external service providers. Don't forget that your AB accreditation certificates for 17025 accreditation provider, your ISO 9001 registrars, and your proficiency test provider. So Tony, thank you for putting your 2 cents in there. I really appreciate that. Gary has another question, and I know that we have some limited time. So if we don't have everything, if we don't get through everything on this list, we'll definitely be in touch to make sure that we get through all these questions, because we got a lot of them coming in. Any thoughts on how to incorporate evaluation of suppliers into management review?
So when it comes to the management review, what I see a lot is organizations having some sort of template for management review. So if you want to just throw in there, like, let's say, for example, you meet all of the requirements that are in 892. So, all of those things that are listed out, A through I think, or I don't remember how many letters there are that fall under 892. But then if you want to go ahead and throw in, evaluation of suppliers at like the very end of it, and then that way you just have the to-do item that during your management review, every time you're going to evaluate your suppliers, and then you automatically have that record at the end of it. That would be my suggestion, and what I tend to see organizations do when they incorporate things into the management review.
Mm-hmm. All right. So for our customers that are on the webinar today, the workflows that you see here are best in class. If you don't have them in your system, I highly recommend reaching out to your account representative, and they can talk to you about how we can get the best in class to you and what would be involved. And we would just need to make sure that you have the right amount of licensing and such to do that. I've got some people asking for quotes. We'll make sure to reach out to you to talk to you about what that would look like for Qualtrax. The workflow diagram at the bottom is actually an image. So if you are, again, a customer and that's something that you want to make sure that is being added to the bottom of your workflows, reach out to our support department and they will actually show you exactly how to add those images. If they're best in class workflows that are ours, we can show you how to add those based on those best in class. If they're your own workflows that you've created, you're going to need to actually create those diagrams and bring them into Qualtrax. And we'll just do a couple more questions and then let's see, make sure. How is a government lab required to incorporate procurement procedures out of the laboratory's control? Oh, great question.
Is this one for me? Or
yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
How?
And Cynthia, you might need to expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, a little bit.
Are you talking about like your laboratory is not actually doing the procurement itself? You've got a procurement team that actually will make the purchase and you're wondering how to track that?
Or do you have like, I guess, do you have like a corporate body? So I know, like, for example, I don't deal with a lot of government labs, but I deal with a lot of labs that are like branch systems. And so they'll have like a corporate body and then like all of the different local branches. And so the corporate body will actually handle like all of the QMS documents and things like that. And then the local bodies are responsible for following those. But in that case, the corporate body is accredited, so they don't have to worry about, making sure that the requirements of the standard are actually being met. But I don't know if that's the same situation for Cynthia.
Yeah, she says, yes, someone outside of our department does procurement.
Got it. So in that case, so that's kind of that's an interesting one. So I would just communicate the requirements maybe to them and try and just ensure that whatever they provide to you, you just double check to make sure that they're meeting the requirements. And then maybe you can provide feedback and say, hey, I don't think that this is being addressed. I don't know how your organization works and if you have the ability to communicate to them and try and kind of guide them towards the right direction. Because as someone who's under the 1755 accreditation, if there are people outside of your bubble, it is your responsibility to make sure that they're meeting those requirements.
And we even have somebody else jumping in. I can elaborate on the question of the government providers. The government labs may have to purchase from a particular vendor as required by the organization, and it's sometimes not their choice. What do you do in that case?
Okay. That's interesting. So I haven't experienced that. Let me look at the standard really quick.
We have somebody else that I'm really liking the collaborative effort that everybody is putting in here. This is really cool. And so somebody else even said the lab will still have to evaluate whether they are purchasing or not. And he mentioned that when you were actually going through it. So he actually says exactly, BB.
Okay. So. Okay. Yeah. So I would say that there still needs to be some evaluation, and maybe that's just your requirement. Maybe your criteria is it's dependent on the government body. and what they choose to do. But I feel like it may also, depending on what the product or service is, you are going to want to make sure that you're also meeting your accreditation body requirements. So the ILAC requirement that I mentioned before, where the P series it is imposed on you to have an accredited calibration done on your pieces of equipment. So that's also something that you're expected to follow. And so I don't know if there's a way to work around that, or if there's a way to put in a request to say, hey, we need to make sure that this is also met. I know that we have these particular providers that we can use, but is there any way to go about, addressing these other requirements that are also being put on my organization? And a lot of times government requirements do trump the standard requirements, so you may not have to worry about it. It's really just dependent on the context of what exactly the product or service that you're getting provided to you, and then going from there to make the determination of whether or not it's acceptable for the standard.
We're going to do one more question, and that's it. And for anybody kind of moving forward from this webinar, if more questions come up, I highly recommend sending them to us. But you can reach out to me at Karen@Qualtrax.com. You can send them to webinar. We'll make sure BB gets them so she can help provide some of the answers, because we've just had some really great conversations, but we do have to unfortunately end the webinar. But one more question. With the new requirements, have you seen deficiencies related to supplier approvals or product approvals related to software suppliers?
Not in my realm. So I deal with materials testing and inspection bodies, inspection bodies is kind of outside of 17025. It's under 17020, so not super relevant. But of the material testing organizations that I deal with, I haven't seen anything. Typically, the only software-related deficiency that I've seen is just them not recording the firmware version, which is a requirement in 6.4.13, I believe. But other than that, no, I haven't seen anything like that.
Great. And then we had 2 more comments come in about the government tracking and purchasing and such. And one is from Sarah. As a sheriff's office laboratory, we have the following. We have to follow certain requirements of the business office for ordering. We just state that in their operations manual that we follow all of their guidelines. And then Jessica chimed in and said, in our government laboratory, we, the lab, are involved in the contract process with the acceptance criteria for the proposal when buying products and services. So again, everybody who joined here and gave their feedback and asked the questions, we really appreciate this. And it kind of makes us think that we should have some more roundtables to kind of go through some of this information and open up to see how people are handling different things. So thank you so very much, everybody. BB, thank you. I think that this was a really great one with some great information. So hopefully we can do more of these in the future.
Yes, for sure.
All right. Well, everybody, you have a great Wednesday and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.